Shavua Tov. Today I'd like to talk about Yishmael, the son of Abraham. And I want to begin by reading from Masechet Sukkah, Nun Bet, and quoting Amar Rav Chana Bar Acha, Imri Berav, Arba'a mitharet עליהן הקדוש ברוך הוא שבראם, ואלו הן גלות, כסדים, ישמעאלים, ויצר הרע. Galut, Dichtiv, and it goes on and it gives sources for each of them, so I'll stop there. So the quote is Rav Chana Bar Acha, quoting a statement of Rav. 4 things HaKadosh Baruch Hu regrets creating, and here they are. Galut, meaning exile, presumably the exile of Bnei Israel from Eretz Israel. Kasdim, which in English is usually translated as Chaldeans, which refers to, at the very least, the city where Abraham comes from, Ur Kasdim, and more generally Shinar, Bavel, Babylonia, Sumeria, that area. Yishmaelim, the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, and Yetzer Hara, which is sometimes translated as the evil inclination. But we can talk about it in its turn, what it generally means in our tradition. But essentially, it's, the inclination people have to do wrong, but you might also say it has more specific connotations with respect to temptation, the temptation of idolatry, the temptation of forbidden sexuality. And you might say beyond that, if you want to read the meaning into the word Ra that we have from another shiur, that Ra is really about kind of looking at the world in a negative construction that comes from that which seems most objective, that you look at the world and it seems it has to work a certain way and you're boxed in by reality, and then you have to make choices that often lead to sin as a result. So 4 things, again: exile, Chaldeans, Ishmaelites, and the evil inclination. Hashem regrets creating them, which is a strange phrase, first of all. And now I think the interesting thing is to try to give different readings of this, and we can make them maybe subtler or more sophisticated as we go down the line. So the simplest reading of this, the reading maybe a child would give it is, here are 4 things that are bad, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu regrets creating them because they're bad, and they are exile. Like, he wishes that we never had to be exiled from the land. He thinks the Kasdim are awful. He thinks the Ishmaelites are awful, and he thinks Yetzer Hara is awful. All of those are things that, it's terrible that they're in the world. It's sad, but they have to be that way. Like, the implication is, obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't make mistakes or really do things that he finds out later he didn't want to do. It's more like he's commiserating with us or something, right? That he understands that from our perspective, there are these things in the world that seem to make the world worse, and he can sympathize, even though obviously he created them, so they're part of actually the overarching good of his creation that he intended. But there's this question of why, because obviously from our perspective, we don't like being exiled from the land. And then, you can go along and say, well, why don't we like these things, right? So we obviously, exile from the land is bad. We don't like that. But then, going on, when you say Kasdim could mean Babylonians, basically, right? And to the degree that it does, they are the ones who exiled us from the land. They caused us pain when they exiled us from the land. And so this is about exile from the land as being a painful thing, and then the Kasdim are sort of the cause of it. And then you go over to Yishmaelim, and you could read this prophetically and say, well, the Torah understood that Yishmaelim were going to just be kind of, because they're nomadic, because they therefore don't have kind of a big physical plant that can kind of build up but then collapse, but rather they can just kind of hang around in the desert and remain in this place. You can either say rationally or prophetically the Torah anticipates, and Chazal, in addition, are sort of anticipating that Yishmaelim in this region are here to stay and are going to be around. And so they're, of course, going to be around when we come back out of exile, which, if you understand Yishmaelim to be a terminology that now applies to various kinds of people living in the land of Israel at the time when Bnei Israel were coming back onto the land, and the Jews were returning to build the state of Israel, more than a century ago, and since, that they are at times our enemies and a source of great pain and a source of great tribulation, sort of the same way that the Babylonians were on the way out into our first exile, that now coming back, there's all of this war and tribulation that's associated with all of the opposition that might come from that quarter. Now, you can make this more complicated because there are people who would want to suggest, well, you can't just say anyone who, for example, speaks Arabic would count as an Ishmaelite. We shouldn't say Hezbollah is Ishmaelite or Hamas is Ishmaelite. Maybe the Ishmaelim are more like the Bedouin, and there's a more complicated story, right? But I think that that's going too deep into detail here. The point is that there's this anticipation of people who are going to be at low density, hanging around in the land when we come back, and at least a segment of them are going to turn out to be very vicious enemies and make a lot of pain for us in our return, the same way that the Kasdim made that pain for us when we left. And then you could see the last one, Yetzer Hara, it's kind of being the capstone on all of this, right? That it's the explanation for it all. Like, it's not just another thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, regrets creating. It's more like you list those first things. There's exile, there's the people who caused the exile, and that was terrible, and they were cruel to us. And then there's the people who are trying to prevent us from returning from exile, and they're cruel to us. And then what's the explanation for all of it? Where does it all come from? It comes from Yetzer Hara. It comes from our Yetzer Hara, which caused us to sin and therefore to deserve a certain amount of suffering. And it also comes from the Yetzer Hara of these other people who treat us horribly and exiled us or are, cruel to us in our return to our land. So that's one, I think, fairly straightforward way of reading this from start to finish. And again, I think, it's rooted in the notion that it's really trying to explain to you the necessity of something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. It's not about really saying Hashem wishes that he didn't do this. He can't, or not that he can't, but he wouldn't wish that he didn't do something that he chose to do because what he does is correct. But if he's gonna admit to us that there's something he appreciates is frustrating or difficult, it's like that it pains him as he's doing it, that there's no other way because of Yetzer Hara in the world, that he made the world and people with Yetzer Hara because that serves his purpose. But that means, in a sense, that the way to write the history of the world involves a certain amount of setbacks and suffering for his people. So I think, that's one way of reading it. And that's there in the text, fairly close to the surface. And you don't need to eliminate that in order to move over to another possible meaning. But I think there is another possible meaning, which is counterbalancing in an interesting way. And that is to say that it's also interesting that if you just look at Kasdim and Yishmaelim, they both very much more specifically connect with Avraham Avinu, right? You could look at them as, being elements in the history of Am Yisrael, but you can also look at them as being about Avraham Avinu, right? Avraham was from Ur Kasdim. The Torah tells us that. And Yishmael was the son of Avraham. And so the interesting thing here is then Kasdim is kind of the moment where you have this separation from the rest of humanity, right? Avraham was part of all of humanity, so to speak. And then, in order to form Am Yisrael Avram was separated from the rest of humanity to become the beginning of something unique and different, this creation of a nation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses to be his people. And in the same stretch of lifespan for Avraham Avinu, he also produces his son Yishmael, and Yishmael goes the other way. He's the sort of diverging path, right? That we separated Avraham from the rest of humanity, but then Yishmael kind of represents the offspring of Avraham that go back to humanity, right? Not all of Avraham's offspring become part of Am Yisrael. And so there's also this kind of taking of that which came from Avraham and saying, this part is not being chosen. So both of these things are kind of also about the moment of Am Yisrael being chosen to be separate, and seeing in this moment, or not one moment, but this moment in history where Avraham Avinu is the focus, that there is this regret about the need for there to be a kind of a group of people that gets set aside and separated to create Avram, like that, regretting the need for Avram to exist, that there had to be kasdim, either where you could say you feel sorry that they're getting left behind, perhaps, or also sorry in a sense that we needed to create perhaps such wicked people in order for Avram to come into being, right? Like that Avram comes into being in reaction against their idolatry, in reaction against everything that was deficient about their civilization. And then similarly, going over to Yishmael, you could say, oh, well, it's like it's regret that there has to be any kind of separation after Avram, and that someone's going to kind of go down a different path and down a more crooked path that leads somewhere more problematic. Or so it in that sense, again, it's also kind of having compassion for the one who's getting separated. Or you could say also kind of regretting that Avram should play a role in creating something that was ultimately not the sort of the higher purpose that his seed is dedicated to by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation of Am Hashem, down the line. And then I think, with Galut and Yetzer Hara, bookending this, that's where, you have to look at it as, well, Galut is about our separation from our land, right? And so it is also about, in a sense, a pre-existing condition that leads to the divergence of paths or something, where the land and the people were together, and then the people went one way and the land went another way, so to speak. And that's similar to, the Kasdim going one way and Avram going another way, or Yishmael going one way and Avram going another way through Yitzchak. And I think Yetzer Hara, you could say, is the sort of the parting of ways of us with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Of humanity with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That Yetzer Hara is where our path goes towards Averah, towards transgression, or goes towards a view of the world that excludes HaKadosh Baruch Hu from the picture and sees the world as a mechanism. Either way of reading Yetzer Hara works in this sense, that it's like we push HaKadosh Baruch Hu away and we go our own way, that he was mitalech, in Gan Eden, like waiting for us to walk with him, and we weren't there. We went a different way to Averah with, eating from the fruit, so to speak. So there is always all this sense of the regret that there should be things that Hashem is creating that involve paths diverging, and not everyone is going on the right path, or that there's some kind of leaving of someone behind, all of that kind of separation. So there's a bit of kind of heartache in that is not purely critical of even the negative things that we're talking about, right? Like the Yishmaelim and the Kasdim in this picture, one feels more sorry for them to some degree, and one feels HaKadosh Baruch Hu's regret that there should be some kind of separation amongst all of his creations, and that they couldn't all just collaborate happily and do the right thing together, at least initially. And, I think one has to think about this in turn a bit mechanistically, meaning that the fairy tale scenario, or I don't know, maybe that's the wrong term, but like the childish imagining of a scenario in which everyone just gets to play nice together and do the right thing from the outset, that sounds nice, but the emphasis here is on HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the creator, that he created the world a certain way. And the point is that what it is to create that which HaKadosh Baruch Hu views as being worth creating is that he has to create a world in which there is nature that presents itself as a mechanism and that produces temptations, and that there is in that world Yetzer Hara, that he wants human beings to be capable of seeing the world as a mechanism that they can exploit, or seeing the world as a temptation to Avera, because none of this is really worth anything otherwise. The possibility of choosing correctly implies the possibility of choosing incorrectly. And once you are writing a story about people who have a tendency or an inclination to act a certain way, then you need to think about, okay, what would be a plausible way for that story to unfold such that you can have someone like Abraham and you can have something like Am Yisrael in its land, but you still are dealing with human beings. And that means that human beings have to have a history. They have to come from somewhere. So Abraham has to come from somewhere. If not everyone can be Abraham, then where did he come from? He comes from Ur Kasdim, and Ur Kasdim is a place that was somehow meritorious enough to produce Avraham, but still fundamentally flawed and problematic in a way that sends it on another path and on a more tragic path, ultimately. And then with Galut, exile from the land, it's a similar kind of idea that Am Yisrael, we're Hashem's people. We are Hashem's people. And we're in the land in the time of Shlomo Melech and in the time of Chizkiyahu and in the time of Tzidkiyahu, up to the Babylonian destruction, and throughout all of that, there was enough merit in what they were doing that they received the land as promised in the Torah, and they were living in the land, and they were kind of trying to keep the Torah, and some people were doing it better than others, and some were doing horrible things, and when you added it all up, their ability to choose wrong led to the Galut. And so you have over and over again this idea of like the Yetzer Hara in this four member set is kind of the explanation for the rest. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately wants to create the world with a Yetzer Hara in it. He wants that to be the basis on which the whole story is written, and on that basis, you're going to have people are going to have multiple children, and they're not all going to go the same way. So that's Yishmael going one way and Yitzchak going another way. And people are going to have, the land that they live in, or the Am Yisrael are going to be trying to keep the Torah, and they're not going to succeed enough. They're going to become idolaters. They're going to be murderers, and then they have to be punished and they have to be thrown onto the land. Right? It can't be that it's, and they all lived happily ever after because they all kept the Torah perfectly the first time around, because we are beings and sort of a society and a culture and everything that has to learn from experience in order to improve. That's actually the kind of process that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to develop. And that means we have to fail, and then we have to have galut. And also, Avraham has to have a place he came from. It has to be the case that even if he was righteous in this unique way that was world-changing and historic, that he had parents and grandparents, and he had a society that gave rise to him, and it wasn't a perfect society, and it wasn't full of people just like him, and he in turn wasn't perfect, and he had some of the flaws of that society to some degree, and that's why he had to communicate those flaws to Yishmael and also through Yitzchak to Israel and down into what led us to Galut, etc. So I think ultimately we get a very balanced view from this passage that there is both a willingness to acknowledge that, in a sense, there are some things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to apologize for to us, in a sense, that he's very sorry to see perhaps the Babylonians torment us and throw us into exile. He's very sorry to see the Yishmaelim torment his people as they try to return to the land. And yet at the same time, there's also the sense of seeing the degree to which the chosenness of Am Yisrael leads to some kind of separation from the rest of humanity, and feeling a kind of sadness or a kind of pity or a kind of regret that it needs to be this way. And again, I think the idea is that it couldn't be any other way. Once HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides, all right, he wants to do this in a world where there's Yetzer Hara, then it's like, how do you get to the final destination? It has to be through this limping process where there's all of this, imperfect things giving rise to other imperfect things, and the paths splitting and leading different ways. And I think you can also identify this sense of regret, just to like close off this point, in a somewhat related element that we have elsewhere in the tradition, which is that Chazal, our sages, say that when the shofar is blown, that it should sound like the voice of Sisera's mother weeping. So Sisera was this scourge of Israel who, in the time of Devorah HaNeviah, Deborah the prophet, has this war with Devorah and Barak, and he flees from the field of battle after being routed and hides in the tent of Yael, the Canaanite, and Yael then kills him after putting him to sleep with a skin of milk. And then there's this song of Devorah, and in the song it talks about how Sisera's mother was waiting at home for her son to bring back the spoils of war, and he's not coming home, and so she's crying because she knows that he didn't make it. And the word that's used to describe her crying is tiyabev, that she cries, and that verb of yivava, of crying, that's supposed to be the sound of the shofar, according to Chazal. That's how they describe it. And very similarly to this passage in Masechet Sukkah that we were just referring to, there's this double-sided nature to the statement, because on the one hand, we should blow the shofar and feel victorious and celebratory on Rosh Hashanah, or remembering Har Sinai, that we're celebrating our receiving the Torah at Har Sinai to the sound of the shofar, and it's a happy time for us. And so hearing Sisera's mother crying that Sisera is dead is a reminder that our enemies are defeated and we win, and that's a positive thing. And on the other hand, the giving of the Torah is a moment where Hashem is choosing Am Yisrael, and in a sense, therefore separating us from the rest of humanity. And that can't help but connote a certain kind of rejection. And it isn't actually a rejection of humanity, but it can feel that way. And the tradition perceives that emotional cast can thread through things. And so it's also saying, maybe when we blow the shofar and we remember Har Sinai, and we're thinking about receiving the Torah, and we're thinking about how we are Hashem's people, and we're glad about that we also should remember the sound of a mother's voice crying, which is a universal thing that we could all have sympathy on. Any human mother crying over the loss of her child. It's very pathetic and universally evocative of the same emotions, that we should remember to have that sympathy in the moment where we're tempted to just exult in our chosenness. And then that's why, we're blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, because that's really the day to remember Hashem is the creator of the whole world and the king of all of humanity. And so there is a universal structure underneath the particularism of Yahadut, where we're going to remember that the mother of our enemy crying is still a human being and a mother, and we should remember the sound of her crying and feel a tinge of sadness for her and for humanity in general, even at the moment where we might feel tempted to exult in our special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So those are two different passages in Chazal, in statements by the sages, that I think contain these ideas. And I just want to close this up by finishing with a comment about Yishmael that is more about the Torah. Because I think that maybe it's unrelated to the text that we just referred to, but in another sense, it's hiding in the background a little bit. There's something a bit odd about the question of the nature of Abraham's relationship to Yishmael, as far as how he viewed the tradition that he was passing on and what Yishmael is, because there usually is a way that we read the stories about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar and Yishmael, which connects with Rosh Hashanah, one of the Torah readings that we read in Rosh Hashanah. That's about, people usually call about Gerush Yishmael, right? Like the expulsion of Ishmael, and it is an expulsion of Hagar. But I was thinking about this after a shiur we did recently, where talking about how the son of Hagar was mitzachek, was mocking, and how that connected with Lot being perceived as being mitzachek when he was saying, we have to get out of here, that the possibility was that really Hagar and her son were saying, we need to get out of here, meaning go back to Egypt. And that really, if you view it in that way, there's something much more legitimate about Sarah saying, no, we're not getting out of here. So divorce her and let her go. If she wants to go back to Egypt, then let her go to Egypt. So divorce her, because that also is the meaning of garesh, right? It's not just expelling her, like turning her out to the desert to die. It could also mean, cut ties, because she's insisting and her son is insisting that they want to go, they want to leave. And when they're not going to convince us to leave Canaan, because the mission that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us is to stay here, right? That if we read it in those terms, then we can understand better from the perspective of Abraham and Sarah why it could be the right thing to do what at first seems like kind of a crazy move, to disinherit Yishmael and push Hagar and Yishmael out into the desert to nearly die, when it just seems like at first this is on the whim of Sarah, like, oh, she got irritated because the boy was mocking or something, and so she decided that she would just send these two people to die in the desert. So it already makes more sense if it's more like they were demanding to leave, and Avram listened to Sarah and they decided to stay and therefore had to cut ties. And then, people got lost on the way to Egypt, which was their fault and not Avram and Sarah's, let's say. But I still think that there's something to fix there, which is that something in this doesn't fully make sense, in that Ishmael was too close to Avram for things to work this way. The idea that you could raise your son basically to be almost an adult, and for a significant period of that time, for him to be your greatest hope of having an heir that could receive your tradition. And you named him Yishmael, right? His name is, he hears God, right? So he's not just a son Avram had on the side that he took no interest in as far as what he ultimately could become. And in fact, there even is a recorded dialogue of Avram with God saying, well, can Yishmael be the one who inherits and who sort of receives the mission? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, no, there's going to be Yitzchak. So it has to be, because it has to be the son of Sarah. But Yishmael was born not to be really just a son of Hagar, as though Avram had more than one wife, but originally the idea was that he was to be born, so to speak, on the knees of Sarai, right? That she couldn't bear children, so she had a maidservant who could be a surrogate. But the concept, when that is done in this kind of a relationship, would have been that he'd be effectively her son, right? It's the same thing we see in this most recent parashat Vayetze, when you have Leah and Rachel having their maidservants produce other children for them. Like, especially with Leah has a significant bundle of children already that she's produced at the point where she has Zilpah step in and produce another child for Yaakov. So if she already is capable of producing children and she's done so, why would she give Zilpah to Yaakov? Not because Yaakov wants to have a son and Leah can't give him that. It's because she herself has these children that she gets to name and that are recognized as belonging to her in a sense, even though they're born through a surrogate, right? So if that's the practice that we're talking about, we can leave aside the question of whether that's a sensible practice or not, then or now. But if we leave that aside, if that was the idea also with Hagar and Yishmael, then Yishmael was supposed to be, kind of a son of Sarah, and maybe that didn't totally take, but it also just the age that he must be at this point. He was 13 years old when he had Brit Milah, when he circumcised with Avram. And Avram circumcises himself, and Yishmael is circumcised, which is a very substantial sign of connection to the faith, right? It becomes a core element of conversion in halakha. So to say that Yishmael went through this process, and then we're a few years down the line probably after that, unless you can always mess with things by reading the Torah non-chronologically. Ein mukdam u'me'ocher b'Torah. Sometimes things are placed seemingly out of order, but this seems less likely to be that, right? That there's a big feast that Avram throws at the moment when Yitzchak is weaned, right? So Vayigdal hayeled Vayigamal Vaya'as Avraham mishte gadol beyom higamel et Yitzchak. So the child grew and was weaned, and Avram made a great feast the same day that Yitzchak was weaned. So if he's a child who's been weaned from nursing, then maybe he's 2 years old, right? And we already have that Yishmael was 13 when he had Brit Milah before Yitzchak was born, and arguably even before he was conceived. It seems like the conception of Yitzchak is something that kind of has to happen after Avram undergoes Brit Milah. So that's a plausible reading of the sequence of events, which means that Yishmael is like 16 years old at this point, and now having undergone Brit Milah, having been named Yishmael, having been born originally to be the son of Sarai or Sarah as a child born through surrogacy, even if ultimately Hagar, sought to play more of a role and that, produced complicated politics in the family, that was the idea. After all of that, for Sarah to just be able to say, you know what, disinherit him, throw him out. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Sarah, he says to Avraham, listen to her, go ahead and do it. Even if, we maybe can accept this reading if it's the case that Yishmael is in his near adulthood saying, we should go to Egypt, right? That's what it meant that he was saying, he was mocking. If that's the case, then maybe you could say that's still acceptable. But then we still have to explain how it is that Yishmael buries Avraham with Yitzchak in Merat HaMachpelah, right? Which is the burial place of Sarah. It's not the burial place of Hagar. Yishmael doesn't show up and say, no, I want my father to be buried in the burial place of my mother. All we hear about him is that he and Yitzchak together bury Avraham in Merat HaMachpelah, which is the burial place of Sarah. So Ishmael eventually is coming back and seeming to sort of participate on the terms of family norms set through Avraham and Sarah down through Yitzchak. And that would be also maybe a strange way to behave if he was simply, kicked out and cut off. And granted, you could always say, oh, well, um, things can be rehabilitated. There's the Midrash that Keturah, whom Avram marries after Sarah dies, was actually Hagar. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And you also could say there's sentimentality and people have emotional connection. And even after all the water under the bridge, you could say Yishmael still comes back and wants to bury Avram wherever Avram wanted to be buried. But with all that being said, it just still seems like the basic idea is that Yishmael, he has too much involvement and too much legitimacy, and for all of that to just suddenly be scrapped because of this moment, unless you blow up the moment a lot, you pump it up with midrashim, which is what Chazal do, and sometimes that's useful and it calls your attention to things in the text. But I just want to notice another thing here, which is the whole thing with throwing out Yishmael and Hagar. We don't really question the second one because we've seen it happen before, right? There was a first time when Sarai throws out Hagar, where Hagar is pregnant and she starts to be uppity, or sort of, to start acting like she is not respectful to Sarai anymore. And at that point, Sarai, the text describes, I don't know, you could say persecutes her. We could also ask about, like, all right, so does that mean that Sarai is, behaving badly or doing the right thing? But in any case, Hagar runs away. And this is where she's going to go to Bar-Hayim, the well of seeing life, or however you want to translate that. But she goes, she hears the voice of a malach. It tells her to go back and that her child will be named Yishmael and he will be a pere adam, a wild jackass of a man, or however you want to translate that. But the point is that expulsion and return is something that we see where Yishmael is explicitly mentioned. The name Yishmael is explicitly mentioned. And then when it happens again, it's like, oh yeah, somehow this happens to Hagar and Ishmael over and over again. Sort of like with Avimelech being the second time that Sarah is asked to pretend to be Avram's sister, same sort of deal. And yet, if you actually look at the second time, this is after Yishmael is born, and we have just argued when he's like 16 years old or whatever, at least, that the next thing that we have is Wateres Sarah et ben Hagar hamitzrit asher yelda leAvraham mitzachek. And Sarah saw Hagar, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Avram, mocking. V'tomer leAvram garesh ha'ama hazot ve'et benah ki lo yirash ben ha'ama hazot im beni im Yitzchak. Okay, so she said to Avram, cast out this slave and her son, for the son of this slave shall not be heir with my son, with Yitzchak. And this was grievous in Avram's eyes. And then Hashem says to listen to Sarah. And then he says he will make a nation out of this son of Hagar. And so Avram gets up in the morning early and helps them to go off. And the whole story, we'll get into more details in a second. But notice in all of this, in all of those psukim, the name Yishmael is never mentioned. Right? It never says anything about Yishmael. It's always Haben, the son of Hagar. And that carries forward all the way through the story, which we just read and say, okay, I know this is about Hagar and Yishmael because I know that Hagar has this one son that I'm told about from Avram, and his name is Yishmael. However, I would want to suggest that this famous midrash that Keturah, the wife of Abraham after Sarah died, was actually Hagar. sometimes Chazal make up midrashim because they want us actually to think about other things in the text that make sense, and they suggest it using a sort of tall tale. And the question I think that comes from this midrash is, what if Hagar had more than one son with Abraham? Okay, so we think when we hear that question, we're so inured to hearing the midrash that we say, "Oh, yeah, he did. He had Midian and Dedan and whatever the other sons or Medan, the other sons that came from Keturah, those were the sons of Hagar." And the Midrash tells us that. But if we don't have the Midrash, now let's ask that same question in the text. What if Hagar had more than one son from Abraham? Could it be that actually this whole episode with Hagar leaving is not about Ishmael? It's about a different son of Hagar who, could be whatever age, we don't know because we're not given any detail, but could be old enough, perhaps, that he is capable of being mitzachek, saying like, "Oh, why stay here in Canaan? Let's go to Mitzrayim." And Hagar wants to go with him, right? Let's suppose that were the case. If that's the case, what would make a bit more sense is that he might still be pretty young, right? Like he could be old enough that he's, a child capable of saying things that are that provoke conversations, right? This idea of being mitzachek, and yet at the same time he could be young enough that Hagar is still in this very maternal role over him, which is another thing in the text, by the way, that we needed to explain, because when we are describing this whole episode where they're in the desert and they run out of water, and then it's "Watashlech et hayeled tachat ahad hasihim." So the water was spent in the bottle, and so she cast the child under one of the shrubs. If Ishmael is at least 16 years old in this story, which I think has to be the case based on a reasonable timeline, if this is happening after the birth and weaning of Yitzchak, and if Yitzchak was conceived after the Brit Milah that Avraham did for himself and for Yishmael when Yishmael was 13, right? Then Yishmael is basically, especially 4,000 years ago, an adult. And it doesn't make sense that his mother throws him under a bush in order to sort of let him expire while she's far away from him. There's something that just is incongruous about that. It doesn't make sense. Why is she calling the shots in that situation? Why isn't he kind of the strong, young, vigorous hunter who is taking care of his mother as they try to walk through the desert? Now, you can always explain this by saying, "Oh, well, maybe he ran out of water first. He hasn't been drinking the water. He's dehydrated. So she put him under the bush, but, he's, almost a full grown man and bigger than her, but she left him lying under a bush and went, somewhere else." But just the repeated reference to him as Hanar, he's the youth. His youth is being emphasized. That he's not a man, that he's a Na'ar. And you can always play with, well, Yehoshua bin Nun is referred to as a Na'ar to Moshe, but that doesn't mean he was, 9 years old. It means that he was his apprentice or his disciple. Fine. Okay, so Na'ar we can argue about the meaning of, but just the basic, the most, whatever else you can make out of ambiguities and alternate uses of words, the basic description here is she has a youth that she is the responsible adult taking care of in this journey. She gets lost, right? Vatita, it's singular feminine. She gets lost. And so she is guiding them and they get lost. And so then she throws them under a bush, and it sounds, we just don't even think about it. We just think of her like with a baby. It sounds more like child exposure, right? And in fact, it's very evocative of the finding of Moshe, right? Because Hagar is an Egyptian woman like Bat Paro, and the same way that Moshe was in the reeds and because of his cries, the daughter of Paro found him. The Midrash, by the way, suggests that Hagar was also the daughter of a pharaoh. It talks about a bow shot away. There's a Midrash that talks about the arm of the daughter of Pharaoh reaching Moshe, farther away than a normal arm could. So there's all this parallelism with this passage, especially if you knit it together with Midrashim. So it sounds like child exposure, but it doesn't make sense, to say that she's leaving a baby to die in the desert if he's a 16-year-old or more, nearly grown man. And the way I think we can explain that is if it's a significantly younger child, that's a younger son of Abraham, that she wanted to take back to Egypt, and who ultimately ends up in a different place, it seems, than Yishmaelim, perhaps, because it describes them like at the end of the story, Wayehi Elohim et ha'na'ar vayigdal vayeshev bamidbar vayehi roveh kashath. And God was with the lad, and he grew and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an archer. Vayeshev bamidbar paran vatikach lo imo isha me'eretz Mitzrayim. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took for him a wife from the land of Egypt. So his mother somehow is, back connected with the land of Egypt. And Midbar Paran sounds more like it's in like the area of Seir, maybe closer to where Esav is, not necessarily something where we necessarily associate it with the Yishmaelim to the same degree. Although, to be fair, the Yishmaelim are kind of all over the place because they're sort of nomadic. So I don't think that you have to buy this, but I think it is worth noting that there's enough here in the text that provokes us to ask the question whether we really read carefully, right? That maybe there is a scenario in which we say Ishmael maintains more of a relationship with Avraham, that he's not part of this gerush, this divorce that happens, this expulsion that happens. And there is a certain amount of sense to that, because even if Hagar, as an adult who's from Egypt, wants to go back to Egypt, that would necessitate some kind of divorce. But Yishmael, if he's already by that point nearly a grown man, who has a relationship with Avram as his father, who's been named Here's God, and who has undergone Brit Milah, and who ultimately is going to be connected enough to all of that that he's going to bury Avraham along with Yitzchak in Merat HaMachpelah, it just makes more sense perhaps to say that Yishmael stays in Avraham's orbit, right? That really could be a version of the reading that you give to this midrash about Keturah being Hagar, right? The point is not that Keturah was Hagar, and therefore Hagar came back, and all the sons of Abraham, aside from Yitzchak, are descended from Hagar. The point is more that think about the idea of a son of Hagar staying in Avram's orbit more so than you have been assuming is what happens by reading the simple reading of the text. And I think the important point is just the possible implication of that for who the Yishmaelim are and what that ultimately means for Avraham Avinu and his legacy, because there is a sense in certainly in the present day, if you want to follow, this is a little delicate because exactly where we get that Yishmaelim would be associated with what are now referred to as Arab nations, like that's already a complicated question of how robust is our tradition on the question of whether Yishmaelim and Aravim are the same. Aravi is a word that appears in Sefer Nehemiah, for example. At the time of the Second Temple, or the starting to build the Second Temple, you have the notion that there are Aravim in Eretz Yisrael who are already there to oppose the return of the Jews to the land. So that's something that was already a thing 2,000 or more years ago, really significantly more than 2,000 years ago. But it doesn't call them Yishmaelim, it calls them Aravim. But we do have sources that make that connection, but I think it's something that we don't have to go into in detail today. And it's not, I think, in any case, something where it's obvious in all cases that anyone who might be designated as Aravi in the present day that should be also thought of in any biblical sense as being connected with Ishmael. Obviously, there's the tradition within Islam of connecting the Islamic faith to an alternate narrative involving Abraham and Ishmael, or some notion of Ishmael. And so certainly to that degree, there is some basis for associating Ishmael with Islam, but I think it's very hard to make the case from within the Torah that when the Torah is talking about Ishmael, that it's obvious that it's also referring to Islam in the specific sense. But in the general sense, I think what the Torah is anticipating is that there's such a thing as Abrahamic faith, meaning there are nations that are going to come from Abraham that are not Abraham's eventual line into Yitzchak and Yaakov and Am Yisrael and the particular breed that's going to be made with that particular people who will be Hashem's people on the basis of the Torah, right? That Abraham has other things to give to the world in terms of nations that will come from him. And it's all too easy to just think, oh, yeah, and they weren't on the right track. And so, maybe Ishmael was kind of a nice guy, but whatever nation came from him, they must be, Rishaim, and they must be on, the wrong path. And what do we care? But the more interesting thing, I think, is to think about, given who Avram was and what he had to teach his descendants, how much of that does filter down and how far, right? Like, at what point does all of the good teaching from Avram really damp out and no longer have its effect felt, versus a scenario where you say those nations that come from Avram, they're going to have something going for them that does genuinely reflect some kind of knowledge that he had, that he could teach, some tradition that he could create, and that is in some sense relevant, more relevant to Am Yisrael and its present and future than a completely randomly selected nation and ideology from around the world. And you see evidence of that even with the Midyanim, right? Midyan is descended from Avraham through Keturah, and Midyan is the place where Moshe kind of learns to be a Navi. So we already have this idea in a sense that maybe Moshe was reconnecting with something Abrahamic when he was exposed to Midyan. So even though Midyan ultimately becomes the enemy of Am Yisrael, that they were kind of, on the other hand, kind of holding a torch from Avram that they passed on to Moshe, and that was possible. So Yishmael being more rehabilitated in this version, it doesn't mean, now it turns out that must mean in the present day that Yishmaelim are, considered the same thing as Jews, according to the Torah. But I think it more like is posing the question, how should you think about your cousin nations or cousin ideologies and what it is that they have that does come from Abraham, and how does that, position them and you with respect to each other so that there's some possible mutual benefit or eventual detente or whatever else. And that's a very hard question in the present era, because obviously if we think of that in terms of, should we be looking at Hamas and Hezbollah and saying, oh, well, they're Yishmaelim and they're also descended from Avram, and so let's all have a big family party together. Obviously, it can't work that way. And, that's due to them and their murderous hatred of us and their desire to wipe Am Yisrael off the face of the earth and prevent us from fulfilling the mission that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us. But I think it does at least call your attention to the fact that there are aspects of what they're doing that has, an operating system that has better characteristics than some others in terms of, how that looks from the perspective of Torah, right? They say there's one God who created the world, and so do we, right? That is not enough, right? It's not enough to agree about that. And then when you fill in the details of who that God is and what he wants, if you have completely different stories about those details, you can end up actually not be worshiping the same God. But it does point to a susceptibility, perhaps, in the world of Hezbollah and Hamas, or people with adjacent ideological dispositions, which is to say, if you could come up with a pro-Torah version of that, of what they're doing, then of course they'd have to change a lot of what they were doing as a result, because the Torah would make different demands of them. But there's a core aspect of what they're insisting on that is already kind of receptive to the notion on which all of the Torah is based, right? That there is one God, that he created the world, that he has laws that he wants humankind to obey. He has laws that he wants Am Yisrael to obey, and that he cares about the morality of our actions, right? Nothing there yet explicitly contradicts, because I was being vague, like nothing there yet explicitly contradicts anything that you might find in that other Abrahamic ideology. But then it's like when you get down to details, then you start to come across things that are going to be more in tension. And so, I to close, I think I do notice, and maybe this is the weakest thing to say, but I can't help noticing, this statement about Yishmael when he is named, right? When Hagar is bearing him, and in this her first expulsion, the Malach says to her, "Vehu yihye peri adam yado bakol v'yad kol bo ve'al panei chol ehau yishkon." So he will be a wild man, or an ass of a man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall live in the presence of all his brothers. This last point of Ve'al panei chol ehau yishkon, that he will dwell in the presence of his brothers. The word yishkon is interesting to me, because when we go to Noach, right, that there's this statement about Yafet, the brother of Shem. Yaft Elohim leyefet v'yishkon be'olei Shem v'hi chena'an eved lamo. God shall enlarge Yafet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his slave. And that, you can argue pretty easily, is a reference to the need for Yafet being Greek, sort of the Greek notion of idealized beauty and wisdom and craftsmanship, that has a place in the Mishkan, in the dwelling of the presence of Hashem, that Shem, or that Am Yisrael, will build. So ultimately, there's a redeemable place for for Yafet, in supporting the mission of Shem, in leading the world in knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, Yishkon could just mean dwells, and you can dwell in all sorts of different ways and places, and it's not maybe always about the Mishkan, but it's not actually something that pops up so often, and it is another instance in which we're talking about brothers dwelling with respect to other brothers, which is pretty more specifically referent back to the statement with Noach and Yafet and Shem. And so I can't help but wonder whether the Torah is also kind of saying, look, if Yishmaelim represent, to some degree, and obviously Esav also could, but if Yishmaelim represent Abrahamic ideological affinity, where you have a kind of ideological cousin that isn't doing what you're doing, they're not necessarily rooted in Torah, they may therefore in some ways be on a crooked path that needs to be straightened out. But it is interesting that I can't help noticing this statement about Yishmaelim, that there is some kind of maybe opportunity for them to be dwelling adjacent to their brothers. And it so happens also, in the place where we should have a Mishkan and Har Bayit, that there already is a tremendous presence there that has to be contended with. And that doesn't mean, they have it covered. We'll just say that that's been taken over now and accept the supersessionism that led to all of the other Abrahamic architecture that now is there on Har. We need to insist on things according to the Torah. But with that being said, it does make one wonder whether there's at some point in the future an opportunity for a kind of ideological persuasion to go on that says, look, you have the right operating system. We need a software update to get things in line. But that when all of that is settled, that there is a tremendous potential for correct Torah-based monotheism in a people who already have some inclinations that are on the right track in that regard, and that may ultimately, therefore, be supportive of and even sort of facilitating of the right kind of thing going on in Har when the time comes. The same way that we need Yafet to help us make the Mishkan beautiful, that there may also be some role for the dwelling of Yishmael. But that's not something that we can do more than hope for at this moment, because there's a whole lot of difficult work to do before then that's more rooted in present circumstances.